we're going to move on with a fantastic session, which is all about esports betting. And we're going to examine the global state of play. This is going to be moderated by the very brilliant and very esteemed Ian Smith, who is the commissioner of the Esports Integrity Commission, ESIC. So, my dear friends, please join me in giving a very warm iGaming Next welcome to Ian Smith. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. These lights are a bit disconcerting. We're going to spend the next half an hour arguing about whether esports is a sport. Actually, we're not. That'd be ridiculous, because for our purposes, of course, it behaves like a sport. It doesn't matter whether it is one or isn't one. I've got a great panel of two experts that are going to help us with this, but just before I bring them onto the stage, I want to run through a very brief presentation just to set the scene, because I never know in these circumstances, you know, the extent of knowledge about esports, what it is, why it's different to traditional sports. So if you bear with me for a second here, what I want to talk about, just to set the scene for our discussion here, primarily around the current state of esports betting globally, but particularly from a regulatory angle, is what is esports? What is the ecosystem that we're all trying to operate in here? And it's a little misleading. I wish they'd never used the word sport with respect to this particular activity, because it does create some confusion. It's an umbrella term, a lot like saying the Olympics. It's not particularly meaningful, because of course esports is a series of games, video games, with individual communities, different owners, different cultures, different metas for the game, and different ways of behaving. And those each have to be treated separately, particularly as an operator. It is very different to looking at offering markets in, say, Counter-Strike Global Offensive as a first-person shooter, or League of Legends as an online battle arena game. And to reach the different audiences for the different games is also a challenge. But every game, and this is the big difference to traditional sports, is owned by a developer or a publisher, which means they can control it. So just as if any of us were to go outside and kick a ball to each other and call it football or call it soccer, FIFA can't do anything about that. They can't intervene. They can't stop us doing that. But were we to sit down and play League of Legends together, Riot Games, as the publisher and owner of that game, can affect or even stop or prohibit or change our participation in that. And that makes a really big difference in the esports betting scene. So we have this ecosystem, the guys that are relevant, and where the publisher developer is God because they own the game. And you have to understand this as an operator, because of course they can change elements of the game and how it plays at any time, which means not only do we have a very short data history, given that video games haven't been around that long relative to traditional sport, but those games can actually change. So at the professional level, and this hasn't happened for a few years, but it did happen, where Valve released a patch for Counter-Strike 2 weeks before a major tournament. Now that's a significant impact. That's like, you know, World Rugby changing the size of the goalposts or the shape of the ball before a Rugby World Cup. It's significant. So the role of the publisher-developer has to be understood to understand the meta of our system. Then, of course, some of those publishers run their own esports leagues, but many of them don't. They leave it to separate organizations like the ESL Faceit group or Blast Premier or those sort of tournament organizers to run their esports events. And then, of course, you've got the betting-related world, you guys, which you're very familiar with, but it's actually very data-heavy because, of course, this is a digital product. So in our world, we're dealing with, obviously, operators, but also the data companies, the regulators, and the bet monitoring organizations like ULIS, IBIA, Sportradar, and various others. So it's a very interesting ecosystem. So what are the key issues for operators? The first is there is no coherent governing body. There is no overarching structure to esports. As I told you, each game is individually owned and behaves as the developer or publisher wishes it to. And because of that, there's no governing body that you can refer issues to or have action taken or standards created. We also have issues around data quality, reliability, and the integrity of data because it's coming from multiple sources, and some of it is official, which of course we favor, but a lot of it is not, which creates problems down the line. And there is regulatory confusion and fear. Any of you who have operated or tried to operate, particularly in the United States recently, this confusion about whether to allow esports, and if you allow it, what conditions you put on it, and all of these sort of things make it a difficult area to go into in the regulated markets. And of course, you've got young-ish or skew young participants where they have not come through the sort of system that traditional sports athletes come through, so that when they reach the professional level, they understand that there are rules that govern their behavior off the pitch, just as much as there are rules on the pitch. In esports, you can go from playing in your mother's basement and 6 months later be earning six-figure salaries playing in professional tournaments. And so all of that background, and in our context, particularly, let's say, anti-corruption or betting-related rules governing your behavior as an athlete are not known, not understood. So it's a pretty vulnerable activity relative to the more well-established traditional sports. The Esports Integrity Commission was founded 7 years ago. And for our purposes, what I really only want to describe is what's called the Suspicious Bet Alert Network, where we incorporate the combined intelligence of operators, regulators, law enforcement, data companies, data monitoring companies, bet monitoring, to try and determine what matches we ought to be looking at to address integrity issues, look at match fixing. And just to set the scene on what that means, and in particular the effect that the COVID pandemic had on us, is that relative to 2019, in 2020, we had a 275% increase in unusual and suspicious betting, primarily because, of course, for a good 8-9 month period, esports was the only show in town. And that brought all the new bettors, new games, new tournament organizers, and it was a bit chaotic. We also saw a strong rise in cheating to win, so not necessarily match fixing or spot fixing, but the ability to obtain, for example, a live stream of the game you were playing in so that you could, as a player, see what you should not be able to see and therefore win. And of course, those teams that were cheating in that way looked very good on paper, playing in online tournaments, and then as soon as they got invited to in-person events or LAN events, they got slaughtered because they weren't as good as they looked, and so they were match fixing on the way down as well as cheating on the way up, and we're still trying to catch up and deal with that. There were also the joy of fake tournaments, which we can talk about at length, but I really want to get the guests for the panel on board, so I want to just put these figures up there to show you how things changed in suspicious betting alerts over 2020, 2021. And you can see that our two biggest problem games from a competitive integrity point of view are Counter-Strike Global Offensive and Dota 2, both published by Valve, and between them making up close to 70% of global handle on all esports betting. So these are really significant games. And you can see, of course, the next biggest betting product in esports, League of Legends, for a bunch of reasons, has far, far less integrity issues. So I'm not going to extend on this very much, just to say that the Esports Integrity Commission is a voluntary regulator for the industry. In other words, any tournament organizer, publisher, or anybody within the ecosystem has to voluntarily take on our anti-corruption code to address these issues. And so currently we work on the one side with tournament organizers and the esports ecosystem, and on the other with the esports betting related industry. And that is the current situation for addressing integrity issues in esport, because there is no other mechanism for doing so. And of course, we can explain why, but in the meantime, I'm going to invite on stage from EEG, Alex Igelman, and from the Malta Gaming Authority, Rowana Sultana. Thank you. You guys want to sit down on that side? Okay. I've already spoken a little bit about the differences between esports and traditional sport, but starting with you, Alex, what, from your point of view, especially as CEO of EEG, are the big differences and why do they make a difference?
Well, I think you touched upon some of the real key issues, and that is that it's really with regards to the IP. And today, esports wagering primarily is content that's wagered on is IP owned by the publishers. And in that respect, the publishers are really in the driver's seat, not only from the perspective of owning the IP, but also they have the ability, if they wish to do so, to really be part of this integrity issue. And that is because the deep data of those players playing in those games has already been collected by the publisher. And any deviation, especially today with AI, I'll give you an example. If a player is playing remotely, as an example, and that player in a P2P situation is giving his controller to someone else. At that point, you as the player that's playing against that player in a P2P situation, you're not able to know who that player effectively really is, because most of these third-party sites, and again, I'm talking about peer-to-peer wagering now, and I know this is not exactly what we were talking about earlier, but in the peer-to-peer situation, you have a really unique situation where a player could give a controller to someone else, and now there's not fair matchmaking. The only true fair matchmaking will occur when the publishers hand over that information.
Yeah. Rowana, what do you think? What difference does it make to your life, this difference between traditional sport and esports?
Yes, with regards to traditional sport and esports, obviously we see similarities in both of them. By similarities, I mean that organized crime groups will target esports the same way that we will target traditional sports. So we are seeing match fixing in esports and suspicious activity in esports by our operators in the same manner that we see it in traditional sports. Also, I must mention that when we're speaking about esports, as you said earlier, Ian, esport is an umbrella term. So there are various tournaments under the term of esports, which is very different from traditional sports, because when we're mentioning football, for example, they're almost mostly the same markets which are targeting. We are seeing more spot fixing in football, that being, for example, the yellow card market being targeted. But when it comes to esports, it's different. It's harder to recognize which markets are being targeted. Having said that, we as the Malta Gaming Authority still follow this up as well and still see means and ways how we can obviously evaluate this and analyze this further. We speak not just with the operators, but we know and we recognize that Malta is an ecosystem. So we also speak with the data providers, for example, and we speak with other stakeholders that are involved in the industry to be innovative as much as possible and create a sustainable environment that is needed as well.
Yeah, and on that same theme, do you think that those differences that we are discussing justify treating esports as a special case from a regulatory point of view, or are you comfortable just lumping it in with sports betting?
Personally, I think that there's a little more that can be done. First of all, for all of you that don't know, Ian really has been the driving force in bringing integrity to the space. But one man is not an island, or one woman. So unfortunately, I think it's a challenging situation. And having said that, to answer your question, I think it should be treated eventually as a regular sport, but unfortunately we're not at that point yet, because I don't think we have complete control of the integrity situation, I think it's a little bit challenging. I should add that my colleague here, Becky Harris, and I have, who was a former head of the Nevada Gaming Control Board, we've written audit standards for what we call for short-form interstitial content. So in other words, bespoke tournaments within a confined space. I consider that a petri dish for the bigger picture, which is eventually, what you really are overseeing, Ian, which is bigger tournaments. So if you can control that environment and use those standards to expand out, I think there'll come a day where we'll be in a great position.
Yeah. Do you think it, I know that Malta doesn't, we'll get on to that, but what do you think personally in terms of that difference? Does it justify greater control by the regulator, or are you comfortable?
Yes, with regards to controls and sanctionings of markets, the Malta Gaming Authority obviously does not sanction any markets, as other regulator does as well, for example, the UK ESIC. And the reason why is that we believe that we rather regulate rather than prohibit markets, because we know that if we prohibit markets, we'll be leading the bettors to use the black markets to place their bets, which is very, very riskier. And obviously, there is no control in that, and what we aim to do is protect the players at all times, so that's why we prefer to regulate rather than to prohibit the markets. Having said that, us as a Malta Gaming Authority as well, under the definition of sports betting, we define sports betting as event that bets can be placed on. So that means that esports is under the definition of sports betting as well. And why am I mentioning and why is this so important? This is crucial because each and every compliance obligation that operator has from a stance of a compliance sports betting regulations, it's the same with esports. So operators are obliged by law to follow the suspicious betting reporting requirements which we have in place, and that means that they need to report each and every suspicious event that they recognize in their systems, and that encompasses esports as well. Yeah. What we do from our end in that regard is we gather all the information and all the suspicious betting reports in which we receive, and we analyze them on a weekly basis. What we do is we formulate a report, and we send that report to the sports governing body. Obviously, it's a bit trickier with esports since there is no sports governing body in place. However, thankfully, there is ESIC, and we send those reports to ESIC and to Interpol as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Alex, in particular, we've seen the new, relatively new sports betting regulations in the United States on a state-by-state basis. In every case, I think, treat esports where they allow it, which is not everywhere, as a separate case with significant restrictions, in my view, overly significant. How is that affecting commerciality for operators in North America? Because I'm going to include Canada now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think you can see it in the handle that's being generated in North America. It's abysmal. And that's because it has not been truly embraced by the gambling community for a number of reasons. Obviously, if you're going to walk into, an old school casino with a sports book in Las Vegas, with a sports book manager and try to sell him, some content that, involves Dota 2 or, any game, League, he's going to, or she's going to say, what is that? However, I think, what SIS is doing and others in terms of this interstitial content, that is much easier to understand. So I think, in my opinion, the growth of esports will first come in North America through this bespoke content, as opposed to, in terms of adoption, as opposed to tournaments betting or peer-to-peer. We've already seen a very similar thing happening in sports. I don't want to mention any particular names. I know a few companies, and you may know, that are creating their own content in sport, whether it's 2v2, basketball or volleyball. And that is, content that's being consumed today. In a similar vein, I believe that this other content will be assumed, but both need standards of audit standards, because today, a lot of that interstitial content, again, there's no league to report to because it's actually operated by the operator themselves.
Yeah. It's really interesting. You know, back when skins betting was still a thing, before Valve cracked down on that in 2016, we estimated, based on handle, there were probably about 10 million North American bettors on esports. Obviously, a lot of those were young and even in a legal market wouldn't have access to it. But there's been a dramatic inability and failure to convert that group to the legal regulated markets. And I'm sure everyone suspects that they're all betting. It's not like they suddenly stopped. It's just that the barriers to entry for the legal markets are so high that it's just not going anywhere commercially at the moment. And so you have two problems. How do you rid North America of the bad operators, unlicensed operators, if you wish to do that? I mean, that's a tactic. Or how do you convert the existing bettors to the legal regulated markets? It's a real challenge, but they are there. We know they're there. It's reaching them that's the trick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I've covered that question already. I'm just going to skip over. This is probably one for Alex more than you, Roanna. Is that I talked a little bit about data reliability. Is this something that affects you as an operator? Or do you have concerns about the sort of scattered nature of the data availability in esports?
I think we're coming to the point now where the market has adopted a model. In the early days, the publishers were not that concerned about the content and the value of that data. Why? Because they saw it as a marketing tool, and really they didn't care as long as they had the viewership. What happened in the interim is that as the world is real, there was a lot of interest in wagering, and so that content, I think the publishers saw that the tournament organizers that they had handed this over to were making a lot of money reselling this. Those are being resold to data suppliers, or data distributors, I should say, and those are then being resold to bookmakers or odds providers. So there is a flow. However, just like what's causing the creation of these interstitial leagues that are not controlled by a formal league is the cost of content. So as we know, margins in sports betting are very low. If the cost of content is very high, your margins are going to be even lower. And so I think operators are looking for other forms of esport related content, whether, it's live, and again, whether that's an esport, no, but it still needs audit standards, or 2 people playing against each other, or 5 people playing against each other in a tournament. This is what really is the important thing. So in terms of the data, I think that there are a number of providers today that are operating, within this scheme, but of course, you're still going to have those that scrape. There's still going to be commercial disputes as to who owns the rights. Do I have a right to sit in the international and have 4 guys marking things or watching it? Questionable whether you can resell that. However, as a lawyer, I'm not going to get into these issues. What I can say now is that the IP issue has not reared its ugly head yet, and it could in the future.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Have you noticed, Roanna, a difference in esports bettors versus traditional bettors? Do you get insight into that with the data that you're seeing from operators?
Yes, when it comes to the data we collect, obviously when operators are reporting suspicious activity to us, we are also getting information with regards to the betting data of the account holders. And that is very important because we understand that operators and events which are being offered with regards to esports is different than traditional sports. And we can't even classify esports as one as well, because each and every tournament in the umbrella term of esports, they have their own characteristics, they have their own culture, and they have their own fan base. So it is important as well for us to understand, and for the stakeholders which we are assisting, because at the end of the day, we are here to assist the investigating bodies and the stakeholders which are investigating match fixing in esports, to understand that each and every tournament, they have their own culture culture and their own characteristics. And that comes with bettors who have their different groups as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world to see that if you're a casual viewer of esports, you could look at, say, Dota 2 and League of Legends and think that they're more or less the same, and yet both culturally and in terms of the rivalry between the groups, they hate each other. And you know, say, how could you possibly say that Dota 2 is like League? It's like, well, it is. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yes.
But you have to treat those potential bettors very differently.
Yes.
A League versus a Dota better.
Yes. In fact, what we have recognized as well, when we see the most reported suspicious events, and we have, for example, football. Last year we had football and tennis in the top 2, and then followed by esports. And when we see esports, we have to even dive deeper into it, because we have, for example, CSGO in first place, we have Dota 2, and we have League of Legends as well. Yeah. And when I'm mentioning these figures, last year, for example, we have sent 226 alerts to the industry, that is our operators, and 42 of those were regarding esports. So it is very interesting figures as well.
Wow. Yeah, it's exactly. As I said on the figures there, you know, we had 126 alerts in 2020. And those are meaningful alerts. Those weren't garbage. It was a bad time. Fortunately, that has declined. Finally, I know the answer, but perhaps others don't. Does Malta restrict what markets its licensees can offer at all? As a regulator, do you tell them what they can and can't offer?
No, as I explained earlier, we do not restrict any market, we do not sanction any markets, and the reason why we do not is we would rather regulate than prohibit markets, so we can protect players better and not lead bettors to the black market as well. Having said that, we do monitor because we have overview of what is happening as well, and for example, during COVID times when we have seen that esports events were being offered more by our operators, because obviously other traditional sports stopped at the time, we also issued guidelines to our operators to make them aware of what they are offering with regards to esports also. So by that, we can monitor and help and support our operators while still creating a sustainable environment for the industry at large.
Yeah. Alex, if you had a wish for that would fulfill all the needs of the ecosystem, but particularly as an operator or somebody in that space, what would your message to regulators be?
That this industry is here to stay, that it will not go away. I know we're short for time, I'll just be very quick. And Deloitte in 2021 did a survey of those under 25, and they consume video games more than in home entertainment, more than TV and movies. So if you think about it, slot manufacturers for years have been making machines based on movies, right? And you know, it's like a big thing, IGT launches Addams Family or whatever it is, right? But here you have people consuming this 24/7, and yet you don't think they want to bet on it? Are they different than others? I mean, are they reptilians? They're not. They're human beings with an urge to gamble, and it's here to stay. So I would want them to be more open, more like the Malta regulators here, and follow, regulate instead of ban.
Yeah. Well, I hope that was helpful for all of you, and we're all around for a little bit longer if anyone wants to ask us some questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Yes.